So Nola is happily chewing on a bottle beside me. It's quite loud. I thought a squeaky toy was best. Oops. The plot itself. How do I even talk about this book? It's so difficult to talk about. I don't know why this book is so difficult to talk about. I've taken notes and I've tried to put it into words. I've tried to figure out how to talk about this book, and I feel like I'm failing. Let me continue. I think the correct expression is buckle up, Buttercup. Hi everyone, it's me, Jess. And granola! Hello? Hello, Granolski. Are you saying hi to everybody? I'm here to talk about the books that I read in March, and there are quite a few of them, and quite a number of them were quite intense. So I think the correct term is buckle up, Buttercup. Might I suggest grabbing a tea, grabbing a coffee, grabbing a glass of wine if you're watching this in the evening, because we are in for a long video, ladies and gentlemen. So I am actually just going to jump right into the deep stuff, jumping right in at the deep end with this trio, which I said I would talk about, and here I am. I'm going to attempt to talk about these books. I am not going to do these books justice. The books I'm referring to are Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, and Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. I want to talk to them sequentially, starting with Invisible Man and then talking about the two slave narratives. And I will try to express some of the connections that I made between them. But I am not going to be able to cover, like, I will just be skimming the surface of what there is to talk about in these books. It's impossible for me to encapsulate everything that you will experience if you read these books. You could do a whole course on it. You could do a whole course on just this book. You could, like, I can't, there's no way on my channel that I could ever cover off enough of what there is to talk about with these books, but I am going to give you my initial impressions, my basic responses to, and a little bit of insight into what my experience was in reading these books. As I always do. I mean, nothing new here. It's just that I feel a bit intimidated about doing this with a book like Invisible Man because there is just so much to talk about. In fact, a full length, probably 1 hour video could be made, like a video essay on Invisible Man, and maybe I will do that at some point in the future. It's not going to be today, I promise. I read this as a group read that I hosted on my channel. I read it with a couple of people who watch the channel. We chatted about it on Voxer, and we read it according to a schedule, and we checked in with one another at the end of each section that we read. There were about 100 pages each, the sections, and the book is 600, almost 600 pages. Although that was really, like, that was really great and very motivating, and I got a lot out of that experience. I think one of the people that was in that group did mention to me that it would have been great if we could have had a full conversation about it, and I would lean towards agreeing with that. It would have been really nice if we could have gotten together on a Google Hangout or a Zoom call. I just didn't think of it, and I didn't propose it, and I didn't put it together. So I apologize to everyone for not extending the read to that kind of a discussion or opening up the read to that kind of a discussion. Well, I apologize to the group of people who participated. So by way of introduction, Invisible Man, written by Ralph Ellison, won the National Book Award in 1953. The other books that were in contention for the National Book Award that year that it won over were The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway and John Steinbeck's East of Eden, which I'm hoping to read this summer. It has been lauded as one of the best pieces of American literature ever written. It's consistently in the top 100 lists of critics and scholars. I am no critic or scholar. I can safely say, as a wee booktuber, that this is one of the best books that I have ever read. I would implore anybody who's watching to read this book. Should is a strong word, but I think everybody should read Invisible Man. It's really one of those books that everyone should read. And I say that because this book is of such important cultural relevance. It's not like any other book that I have ever read, and it tells the story of the Black American experience with so much depth and meaning and symbolism that I don't know how I could not recommend it. I don't know how I could get on this channel and say, oh no, don't bother, it's a waste of your time, you'll find it too complicated or too difficult or too challenging. Now, the book is difficult in some ways, and it is challenging in many ways. It's not always the easiest book to read. There are stories and scenes in this book that are disturbing, that are unsettling, that are upsetting. I think that that's important. Those are important aspects of the book that make it what it is. So I guess I will give it the caveat that this book will not be for you if you're not interested in those themes. And if you don't, although I have to say that, let me just go on to say that this book is about the Black experience in America at a specific time. But Ellison manages to tell the story of our protagonist, whose name we do not know, which I'll get into in a few minutes, our narrator, in such a way that he is able, in my opinion, or was able through my reading, I was able to see and understand, extend that experience to all human. He was able to extend the meaning of that experience to all human beings, and keep the narrative of the Black experience distinct. I don't know how he did that, but he did. By the end of the book, he is able to extend this experience to all human beings, and that was completely masterfully done. So in other words, the issue of identity that is explored in this book, hence the title Invisible Man, and in particular Black identity. But he's able to extend this question of identity to all human beings in a very skillful way by the time you get to the end of the book. He makes the issue of color, Blackness, race, an issue for us all. And you cannot get away from that when you read this book. It's impossible. Whether you're interested in the Black experience and learning more about the Black experience or understanding more about the Black experience, or whether you're interested just in humanity and what it means to what humans do to one another and what their motivations are, then this is a book for you. This is a complicated book, it's complex, and it is not a book that tells a straightforward story. So it's not a plot-driven narrative, which is why I think it's so difficult for so many people to give reviews and talk about Invisible Man. Because the plot, although there are stories, our character goes through wild experiences. It's a wild ride. A lot of crazy things happen to our character. It's not, it's almost like, and there is an overall arc, there is an overall character arc, and there is an overall plot, I guess you could say, but it's not straightforward, and it's not the plot is simply used as a foundation or as a way to frame the issues that Ellison wants us to be thinking about, that he wants us to be questioning, that he wants us to consider. So the plot is really secondary to the themes and the ideas in the experience of the reader, and that is compounded by the fact that Ellison goes back and forth in the telling of the story of our narrator, our unnamed narrator, goes back and forth between stories of experiences that are extremely visceral and extremely surreal, almost unbelievable, and then he swings back to a kind of mundanity, a kind of real life, regular, day-to-day situation that he puts the narrator in. So we swing, there are these big swings in this book. It's a wild ride. It's a super wild ride. It's a book that will weigh heavily on your heart. He is such a good writer, and I was immediately invested in the fate of our unnamed narrator. Make sure you read the prologue. I almost made the mistake of not starting with the prologue. The prologue is really the beginning of the book. It opens where he's living in this basement apartment in Harlem, and he's looking back on his life from the time that he was a young man in college to the time in the South to the time that he moved up to New York and got involved in a political movement, his experience with that, his kind of rise and fall, his sort of fame in that movement, and then he's looking back on his experiences and he's telling you the story of what he experienced. So in the prologue, he writes, this is the only thing I'm going to quote from the book for the moment. There's lots of quotable quotes from the book, but the first paragraph of the prologue reads, "I am an invisible man. No, I am not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me, like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows. It is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me." That's just to give you a little taste of the writing, because the writing is phenomenal. The theme of the book is the theme of identity, and the theme, in addition to the theme of identity, the theme of invisibility. In that way, it details the narrator's story of personal, cultural, and existential alienation. This kind of forced invisibility of the main character and other people like him in the experiences that he has, and his desperate, I feel like it was desperate desire to be seen, but also to understand his own role in society and how he was being used by others in society. And in that way, I think that that was the part of the novel that extends to all of us and moves, and Ellison's able to move beyond the Black experience, although the focus is, of course, on the Black experience in America. So it has a lot to say about race, it has a lot to say about politics, and it has a lot to say about, he has a lot to say about variations between being Black in the South, being Black in the North, what was happening in the political climate at the time, the political party that our main character becomes a member of when he finally does move to Harlem is kind of based on the communist movement. So it's a look at how people develop this is a book about ideas. And I think I need to kind of wrap it up, because if I get too far into all of the different ideas and the way that Ellison handles all of the ideas in the book, I'm not going to be able to talk about the 6 other books that I'm talking about in this wrap up. I initially tried to find out information about this book and I couldn't find out very much about it. I don't know if that's on me. I was very intimidated to read this book. I think that is a misrepresentation of the book. I think it is complex and it is challenging for the reader, but it's so worth it. There's no reason to be afraid of Invisible Man or reading Invisible Man, and there's no reason to be afraid to read books that challenge you and have you thinking and have you maybe sometimes confused, or maybe have you sometimes in disbelief, or that are unpleasant, or that have unpleasant characters, or that you disagree with what your character is doing, for example. It's complicated. And I think it's wonderful. I think it's a wonderful book. I think it's like I said, it's one of the best books I have ever read. There are scenes in this book, there is imagery in this book that will stay with me for the rest of my life. In some ways, he makes his points about racism and about politics very clearly in very simple ways that are very easy to understand, and in some other ways the conversations or the ideas that he presents are more complicated. All the more reason to pick it up. It's the kind of book that I think you could reread as well, despite it being 600 pages, but with some time or space put in between you and your reading experience. So for example, I would like to reread Invisible Man, but I'm probably going to wait at least a few years before I read it a second time. So I will leave it there for my thoughts on Invisible Man, and I would really encourage you to pick it up when you have time to give to a book that may be sort of off-putting if you're looking for a straightforward story, but is endlessly entertaining, digestible, readable, fascinating, in terms of the story that it does ultimately tell. And don't forget to read the prologue first. Read the prologue first. At the same time I was reading Invisible Man, I embarked on a buddy read with Lori to read Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, and Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. This I was reading at the same time as Invisible Man, and it was really cool to be reading it at the same time. It was heartbreaking because I could see how much of Ellison's story was, it echoes, there are so many echoes of the slave experience and the experience of Black Americans coming out of slavery. Point being that it was really interesting to read this at the same time as Invisible Man. Invisible Man was written in 1952, and a lot of the issues of, especially in the parts of Invisible Man where he's in the university at the college in the South, there's still so many echoes of slavery and the consequences of what came after abolition and how Blacks were integrated into society somewhat unsuccessfully / successfully. And so it was really interesting to read this because Invisible Man is so much to do with identity, and like in the opening chapters of Frederick Douglass's narrative, he talks about how he doesn't know how old he is because he doesn't know the year that he was born, because slaves were never, their births were never marked. They never knew what their birthday was, and they were not told. So already upon first coming into the world as a slave, born into slavery, you have no sense of your own age. Maybe like a vague sense, but you don't have any specific sense of your own age. So that's just one way in which there was an immediate parallel to the reading of Invisible Man. And then this experience of reading a woman's accounting of her life as a slave and a man's accounting of his life as a slave was also fascinating. And I could also do a massive deep dive into these two books, which I'm not going to be able to do in this particular video. I will just say that again, I think it's well worth your time to read these narratives. This book was written, Frederick Douglass is telling the story of his life as a slave from, I think he was born in 1818, and it was published in 1845, 7 years after he had escaped from being enslaved to the North. It is very, 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 very good. There's a reason why it's one of the most popular slave narratives out of hundreds of, if not thousands, of slave narratives. And it's extremely accessible, this narrative. I was surprised at how readable it was. I flew through this book. It's short. It's only 100 pages. It is a horrifying account of slavery. The dehumanization, which of course intellectually we understand. When we read these personal stories, it reads like a dystopian horror book. So the idea that this is a real person's experience, it's just unparalleled. It's horrifying. It's dehumanizing. It's unheard of. It's inexplicable. But it's completely accessible, and it's full of meaning and hope. The emphasis on the strength of his will, of Frederick Douglass's will to escape, to be free, his will to teach himself how to read, to educate himself, is like astounding, inspiring beyond. The strength of the Black community that is described in this book is also really inspiring. Frederick Douglass famously writes, "Once you learn to read, you will forever be free." And he, of course, sees literacy as the key to unlocking his freedom. One of the main themes of the book, and I could talk a lot more about the book, and as you see, I have different passages marked, and maybe I'll read you one of them, but he really shows very clearly how slave owners really would, the idea being that if slaves were kept in ignorance, they would never be able to fathom questioning of the situation that they were in. They would never question their masters. They would never question being a slave. They would never question their treatment. And that they would work harder. They would be made to work harder because they would have no ability to conceive of the dream of freedom or dreams for themselves or a future for themselves that was outside of that. So without knowledge, they would never be free. And that is really the main idea Frederick Douglass explores in his book. He takes us to his very lowest lows in this book. He describes being broken before he does get free. And he writes, I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me. And behold, a man transformed into a brute. So that the effects of slavery and keeping people uneducated and crushing them, not just physically, but spiritually and at a soul level, took people's humanity away from them. Like, this is stuff that we already know, but when you read these words and you know that this is this person describing their own experience, it just has, it's imbued with so much more relevance and meaning. And then at the end of his narrative, when he writes, after having been freed, this is what I mean about the community and the feelings of, like, he writes so eloquently about what it was like after he was freed. For the ease with which I passed the year, I was, however, somewhat indebted to the society of my fellow slaves. They were noble souls. They not only possessed loving hearts, but brave ones. We were linked and interlinked with each other. I loved them with a love stronger than anything I have experienced since. And say that I have never loved any or confided in any people more than my fellow slaves, and especially those with whom I lived at Mr. Freeland's. This was a group of slaves that he found community with. Read it, please. Please read these books, please. And then we have Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. This is quite a bit longer. This book is also incredible. So Harriet Jacobs, her story is a little bit different. It's a little bit longer. It reads very well, though, as well as a narrative. It reads almost like a novel, despite the fact that the events of her life are clearly, well, I guess we assume they're true, right? But it reads like a novel almost. It's very, very well written. Harriet Jacobs was alive from 1813 to 1897. This was first published in 1861, and then it was reprinted in the 1970s. And it follows her journey from her life as a slave to freedom. But her experience is quite different from Frederick Douglass's, not only because she's a woman, but also because she had a different experience of enslavement. She was the slave of a master who was very kind to her and her grandmother. And her grandmother was granted freedom and she was educated. Unfortunately, her slaveholder died before she could be free. And then she was kind of re-enslaved by this horrible man, Dr. Flint, Mr. Flint. She was also mixed race, and she never really experienced hard labor or the cruelty that a typical slave would have experienced. So it's a little bit of a different story, and it's coming from a different perspective. In addition to that, she raises the themes and deals with the themes of motherhood as a slave, lover as a slave. So a lot of masters, of course, fell in love with their slaves, and so being the object of sexual desire and being the object of someone's obsession or someone's love as a slave has a bit of a different meaning and a bit of a different experience. And so that was often the case for female slaves, and in particular it was the case for her in her story. And it also speaks to the idea of being a child and having children. So as I said, mother. So being the child of someone who's enslaved and also having children, and the goal really being to ensure that your children can have a better life than you, that they can be free, that they can have a life that's free. Her story is different in many ways. There are parallels, of course, but it's different in many ways from the narrative of Frederick Douglass. And it's interesting, scholars actually doubted this account. They doubted that it was actually written by a slave because of the way that it came to be published. It was published, my daughter was telling me that it was published for the reading and entertainment of white women in the North. And so these books, I mean, it's sort of interesting to think about that these narratives, because I was talking to her about the political implications of Frederick Douglass's narrative and this narrative, and she was talking about how, like, most of these narratives were written for white people. They were not written for other slaves or other Black people. And she was explaining to me, because I need her to explain everything to me, she was explaining to me that that's something that Toni Morrison deals with a lot in Beloved, and also Kindred, which I've already read, kind of revisiting the idea of the slave experience and the slave narrative and the genre. So I'm really interested to read Beloved. I think I'm going to try to read it soon. I read The Bluest Eye, but it doesn't deal with the same ideas. And of course, I read Kindred a couple of years ago, which I thought was fantastic, which I'll leave my review for Kindred linked in the description box below. It was fascinating to read these two narratives at the same time on my daughter's recommendation, and then even more, especially the Frederick Douglass narrative really enhanced the experience of reading Invisible Man. Thank you so much for listening to my thoughts on those books. If you're interested in a longer video on Invisible Man, let me know in the comments below. Maybe I'll be able to pull that off when my semester is over. I still have a couple more books to talk about. I want to talk about the nonfiction book club that I joined. We read Dopesick by Beth, Macy, and we just met last week to talk about this book. I have to say, okay, so this is Dopesick is a term that refers to how people who are addicted to heroin or opioids experience withdrawal and how horrible and sick they feel when they're in withdrawal, and the idea that people stay hooked on opioids so that they can avoid getting sick in this way. Beth Macy interviews dealers, doctors, but mostly she follows families who have been devastated by the opioid epidemic over a period of about 6 years. And she in particular interviews one doctor who I thought was really interesting, who watched this drug crisis unfold in his small town community in Appalachia. She talks to mothers of high school students who overdosed from the drug and became addicted, who go to rehab. She does talk about the human effects, the effect on the town and the effect on the people in the town quite a bit in the story. She does go into some historical detail about opioid use and regulation and doctors, the way they would prescribe opioids, and she does talk a little bit about Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers, but not very much. And I think for me, I thought it was good. I had a little bit of difficulty with it in terms of, I don't think it was very well written. The whole time that I was reading it, I kept thinking, I just want to read Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe because I know it's going to be better written. And I think that Empire of Pain does focus more on the Sacklers, and I think I am more interested in that aspect of the story. I would have preferred if she had written a bit more about Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers, but I think that maybe she couldn't because she was kind of hamstringed by legal constraints, not being able to write about certain things. So yeah, it just made me want to read Empire of Pain. That's what I have to say about it. I think it's a good place to start if you're interested in this topic. It's just that I didn't find it was very well written, and I got a little bit irritated with some of the ways that she handled different things like treatment and solutions and people who were drug addicted. I don't know. I think there were just things that she would bring up, a lot of ideas that she didn't necessarily follow through with in the book. It was good, but I really want to read Empire of Pain now because I know that it will be better. Sorry, Beth Macy. It would be a good starting point if it's something that you're interested in, but I wouldn't say that it was a fantastic read. Now we get into the fiction books. I have 4 more books to talk about. One of them didn't quite live up to what I was hoping it would, and then the other 3 kind of mixed feelings about, but basically really great. I have some questions for you by Rebecca Makkai. I did talk about this book in my vlog, my recent vlog where I drove to Ottawa, because I listened to it as an audiobook. I'm not sure if the experience would have been different if I had just read it, but I did find that it was not as fantastic as I was hoping it would be. I had heard a review from Jennifer Loves Books saying that it was her first 5-star read of the year, and I got really excited about it. I feel like this would be a good book to pick up if you have a long plane ride ahead of you. It is very witty and it's topical. It's the story of Bodhi, our main character, who is going back to the school where it's a boarding school I think it's in New Hampshire, and she's going back to teach a class because she's currently a true crime podcaster, and we discover that her friend Talia was murdered while she was there as a student. A man who was a sports trainer was potentially falsely convicted of her murder. He's Black. One of her students decides that she wants to use this case as the topic for her podcast project in Bodhi's class. And so that opens up the case again for scrutiny, discussion, and Bodhi is trying to remember. So we have these flashbacks where it goes back to Bodhi remembering her experiences around that time, all of the different possible candidates who could have murdered Talia, her own ideas about who murdered Talia, trying to put back together pieces of a mystery, as well as the students raising questions about the unfair, unjust conviction of this man, Omar, who really, there wasn't really any strong evidence against Omar, and I think he confessed under pressure to the murders. I'm trying not to give too much away of the story, but that is the basic plot. The thing about this is that it's, as I said, it's very witty, and Rebecca Makkai brings up a lot of kind of really important topics in these kind of one-liners throughout the book. So important topics about the way women were treated before and how they're treated now, how we treat true crime cases where women are murdered, everything from slut shaming to the way girls are treated in academic environments to race issues because of the situation with Omar being wrongly convicted. There's a subplot about her husband that's really clearly linked to the Me Too movement, but it just feels like it's a lot. So there's a lot of stuff that's introduced, and the way that she introduces it, although interesting to think about, doesn't really deal with any of these topics in any kind of significant way. So you start to begin to feel like it's a little bit repetitive and it's not really going deeply enough into these different issues. I was really on the fence about this one. I think like it has its merits. It was entertaining. I think it's good that it brings up all of these issues, and some of those issues are quite interesting to think about and to look at, but she doesn't really reconcile any of these issues. And for some people that's going to be great. They don't want those kind of things to be delved into too deeply or reconciled in any way. But if you have a desire for that, it's very open-ended, I would say, with these issues. And if you're okay with that, then you're going to enjoy the read. But there's something about it that makes them feel less significant in the way that she handles them when she presents them in the story. And I don't think that's intentional. It just kind of had that effect on me. For me, it was just too open-ended to be raising all of these difficult and important issues, but not really saying anything meaningful about them. So in that way, I got a little bit irritated with it. If you're interested in watching my vlog, you can see a little bit more about my initial reaction, because I was very excited about it and I really enjoyed the first part of it, but it became repetitive and I feel like it's a little bit long as well. So yeah, I have some questions for you by Rebecca Makkai. I read this because it was on the Carol Shields Prize long list. It did not go to the short list, and I think that's completely fair. I would agree that it shouldn't have moved on to the short list. Although I haven't read everything on the list yet, so forgive me for that opinion. Speaking of lists, I want to talk about And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott, which I have since returned to the library. I read this because it was longlisted for the Women's Prize, and it's the only Canadian Indigenous book I've seen listed for that prize. It's Alicia Elliott's, I believe it's her first fiction work. So in that sense, I'm pretty sure it's a debut when it comes to being a fictional debut. And I think that I think there's plenty of evidence of the fact that this is a person who is writing her first novel. And I think that the fact that it's longlisted, I think, is fantastic. I just want to talk about my experience of reading the book. I have heard some negative things about it, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but I still think that this was a really good book, and I think it's well worth your time. So this is the kind of book that I fear a lot of people will DNF, because they will begin to read it and they will get frustrated with the main character or the presentation of the main character's experiences, or at least that's what I've been kind of hearing. I have tried not to look at too much online about this book before I give my review, because I didn't really want to be influenced, but I would implore people not to DNF this book. Like, give it a chance, read it. I mean, I know people DNF, and I know there's a big movement towards DNFing. I get it, but I feel like this is one of those books, this is the kind of book that people would initially want to DNF, and then if they stuck with it, if they really gave it a chance, they would find that it was worthwhile to have read it. I admit that there are parts of the narrative that are confusing. I did get confused myself with elements of the narrative, but I still really thought it was really good. and I thought it was really good. Story about Alice, our main character, who has just had a baby, Dawn, and she is married to Steve, who is a white man, an academic, and he's trying to get ahead in his job. And while there is a lot of commentary on the exploitation of Indigenous experiences in academia. So Steve's area of academic research is on Indigenous culture, and the book starts out, the opening of the book has Steve taking a class in the Mohawk language, which is Alice's language. And he's describing to her his interpretation of different words and using different Mohawk words, and it's just, even that in and of itself is such a brief but eloquent commentary on the whole dynamic. I thought the book was really well done. I do talk more about it and take some quotes from it in my recent vlog, so you can certainly check that out. Alice herself is a writer, and she has aspirations and she has goals, and she wants to tell the stories, some untold stories from her heritage. In particular, she wants to write the creation story of her people, and when she starts to write the story, and she struggles to find time to write the story because she's having these experiences of having to cope with being a new mother in a very white neighborhood, where she has different experiences that she feels are racist, but she's not sure if they're racist because she's confused about these different judgments of her and these different seemingly microaggressions towards her, or what she sees as passive-aggressive behavior by her neighbors and by people who she's surrounded by, because she's not in her community. She's displaced from her community because Steve can't live on her reserve because he's white. There's that part of the narrative where she's disconnected from her community, and she's also seemingly suffering from mental illness, from postpartum depression. Her mother has died in circumstances that are difficult, so she's lost her mother. She starts to spiral. She starts to kind of spiral out of control. And as she starts to spiral, she gets more paranoid. Things become crazier and crazier in her mind. The experiences that she's having are kind of minor, but to her, they're very big and they're overblown in her mind. And so, yeah, it's not an easy book to read, I would say, but I think that I thought that it was very well done. And I think that the number of things that Alicia Elliott is commenting on here is very wide-ranging. And so I think in that way it was a really significant read for me. Covering everything from womanhood to Indigenous womanhood to mental health, obviously, to racism and colonialism in particular, especially in academia. It's just really interesting how I feel like she juggled all of those important themes and was able to make meaningful comments on all of those themes from an Indigenous person's perspective in a way that was really meaningful. If we compare, for example, with I Have Some Questions for You, which was very, very light and brought up a lot of important themes and didn't really do anything with them. So I think that for that reason, there's a lot of merit to this story. The narrative did get more confusing as we moved on in the story because she went back and forth between the creation story that which she was trying to write and retell, and then her own experience near the end of the book. I don't want to give too much away, but she's at a dinner party and she is surrounded by Steve's colleagues, and she just has a break. She has like a psychotic break that leads her to flee. She goes home and she goes into a portal. And it's at that point that she starts to communicate with her future grandchild. So it's like a twisting dimensions, bending dimensions, and it was a bit confusing, but I still think it was fairly well done. I thought it was really good, and I think that people should I think that it's really pretty good. The first half of the book, I think, is very, very compelling, and then when you get to the second half and it does kind of spiral out of control and it gets more confusing, that part is when it gets even maybe the most interesting. I think the writing is really smart, and I think that the perspective of a woman telling the story from the perspective of a woman in a modern relationship, in a modern reality, coming from the Mohawk culture, talking about these themes of motherhood and mental illness and racism, I think it really has a really important place in the reading canon, so to speak, and I think it's a really good book, and I'm really glad that it was on the long list. I'm pretty confident that it's not going to make it to the short list, but I still think that if what I've described sounds interesting to you, then I would recommend that you pick it up. If you can get past the confusion and the, because her representation of her mental health experience is in part the way the book is written. So you're going on this, you're agreeing to go on, dive into this experience with this character. And I think if you're willing to do that, she does it very, very well. That is how I feel about And Then She Fell. I do think that, you know, there are maybe things about it that could have been tighter, better, what have you, but I found it to be quite readable, actually, and quite smart. Have I said enough? I think I've said enough. Then I read a book, this very quiet book called The Observer by Marina Endicott, which I took out of the library. This was a slow-paced, quiet book that I found very readable. As I've spent some time away from it, I think that I thought was really quite wonderful, quite good. I mean, it's depressing, but I thought it was very, very good. It's an original idea, it's original story. Marina Endicott, I've learned since, was a dramaturge in Saskatchewan, I think, and Alberta. She worked as a dramaturge, and I think she's written a few books, but this is a book, it's a very quiet book that explores the life of a young couple who moved to a small community. The wife, Julia, is married to Hardy, and Hardy is an RCMP officer. They moved to this small community where he is taking a post as an RCMP officer, and Julia begins to write for the local newspaper, which is called The Observer, which is where the title of the book comes from. It just tells this quiet story of the life of the wife through the perspective of Julia, the wife of the police officer. They end up having a child, they have a son, but Hardy struggles. He struggles with his experience somewhat silently and alone, because there's this kind of unspoken agreement that they don't talk about their police work with their spouses for a variety of reasons, as you can well imagine. But he's often called out to be at the scene of really horrific car crashes. He's called to fires. He's called to, and there are crimes, but he's more so called to these accidents that happen in and around the community. There are also experiences of like threats. There's one particular character in the community who's run-ins with the cops and then is continually kind of threatening to them. It does get like, it's depressing on the one hand because Hardy he becomes very depressed, and then he has to deal with his mental health, and she, by extension, has to deal with a husband who's having mental health issues, and she herself gets quite low. But there are things about the story that are also very heartwarming. The community around policing that comes together when people are suffering in that way. But like, it's a real true-to-life look at the struggles of policing, the financial struggles that they have, the mental health struggles that they have, the difficult hours, the difficult work that they have to do that they don't generally talk about. Deals with trauma and depression, and trigger warning, it does deal with suicide. And so on the one hand, it was this very quiet novel, but it was deeply disturbing at the same time. It's like a true slice of life book. And I didn't realize how much it had an impact on me until a couple of weeks after I was reading it. But a tragic story about men who deal with life in policing in a small community. So, I mean, if that sounds like your bag, like, I would recommend it. I thought it was very, very good, but it's a downer for sure. I mean, Misery May is coming up. I have to put it on my list of recommendations for Misery May. Okay, so now we come to a book that I read for my book club, not my nonfiction book club, but my fiction book club, which is the last book that I'm going to talk about in this video, which is a long one already, and that is The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride. I was so excited about reading this book. For those of you who haven't heard anything about it, it starts out with a mystery. The mystery is really just a tool, though, for the author to explore relationships between Blacks and Jews. This particular community in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, called Chicken Hill. It's very character driven. There is plot, there is narrative, there is this mystery. They find this skeleton at the bottom of a well, and they're trying to figure out who this person could possibly be and how they got there. Some people have complained about the mystery because you read on in the book and you get so engrossed in the characters and the stories of these characters that you kind of forget about the mystery, or some people have said they forgot about the mystery and then the mystery comes back up again near the end of the book and it does get resolved. People are saying, oh, it could have been written without the mystery. I completely disagree. I was thinking about the mystery for not most of the book, but I was thinking about the mystery, like who is going to be the bones and who's going to have done the deed. And that's just how my mind works. So I was very happy that there was a mystery involved. But that being said, the story is more about this community of Chicken Hill. And in particular, it revolves around this couple, Moisha and Shona, who Shona runs the Heaven and Earth grocery store. They're an immigrant couple. It's the local grocery store. It's kind of the heart of the community. And Moisha runs a club where he has musicians come, and he often has popular jazz musicians come in. There are a lot of different characters. It meanders. It's the kind of book that meanders. It takes you down this little, it's like the narrator is saying, let's gather around, let me tell you some stories about this place called Chicken Hill, and then you hear about this character and their story, and this happened, and this character and their story, and this happened. There are some shocking bits to the story as well that I wasn't expecting. Something very shocking happens that I think it's very significant, and I wasn't expecting it, because I thought I was reading about a mystery. It's kind of disturbing. There's a disturbing thing that happens. I don't want to give away the plot. So Moisha's from Romania, and he's married to Shona, who's a polio survivor. She is like this lovely, warm, loving character, and she ends up adopting Dodo, this boy, who is, although he does have family, like I think Nate is his uncle, then something really dramatic happens in the middle of the book, really upsetting and dramatic happens in the middle of the book that I don't want to tell you about because I don't want to give it away. But basically the story is about the blacks and the Jews in this community in Chicken Hill, and the way that they take care of each other, and the way that they support each other, and the way that they use they're so different. They're coming from such different backgrounds, but they come together in this community in Chicken Hill. And so from that perspective, it's very, very touching. It's slow and it's very character driven. It's not just a mystery. I will say that even though I really enjoyed this book, there was something about the pacing that kind of took me out of the story from time to time, because he went off on so many different meandering tangents to explain different characters and their circumstances in the situation, that I did get a little bit lost sometimes. And there are evil characters in this story as well, I should mention. There are white people in Chicken Hill as well, including a very evil doctor who I can't really talk about because I would give too much of the story away, who, by the way, is part of the KKK and is really not a nice guy. So it brings together the Jewish community, the Black community in kind of the middle of Christian America, and deals with and shows how they're struggling to survive and how they help one another survive. Really, the main idea in the story is the fact that what James McBride is really getting at is how important we need one another to be able to build communities, and like we help each other. That's how we have community. Even for this character Dodo, who something bad happens and he ends up in a situation where he's separated from Shona, he finds a way, even in that circumstance, to connect with another boy and to create a sense of community for himself. I mean, on the one hand, I thought it was really good, and I really want to read some more of James McBride's books, but on the other hand, I did feel like it kind of went off onto too many different tangents for me. I thought it could have been a little bit tighter, but in a way, that is where the charm is, in that idea of, come, let me tell you the story of Chicken Hill, and we go off on this tangent. Parts of it are very, very funny. The characters are very vibrant. They definitely jump off the page. They definitely come to life. It's very engaging. And I can see why so many people love this book. If you've stuck with me to the end of this very long reading wrap-up, thank you so much for being here. It's spring outside. We just had the solar eclipse in Montreal. We had a full solar eclipse. So if you want to leave me an emoji of some kind in the comments that's referential to a solar eclipse, I have no idea if there's an emoji like that, but you can leave me a moon or you can leave me a sun in honor of that incredible moment here in Montreal on April 8th, and I will see you in my next video, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now. This book is of such significance to the Black where's my phone? Where the fuck is my phone? But Ellison manages to tell the story of the protagonist. Nola! Terrified and uneducated, because the idea was that if they were kept in ignorance. Nola, be quiet! Nola! Hey, I have some questions for you by Rebecca. I'm having trouble talking today.